Hello YouTube, and welcome back to the channel. Now, whether you're getting your car out of storage for the spring, or maybe if you've just bought one and brought it home, there's a few things that you want to be aware of. All of these British cars are going to have some common failure points. There's some stuff that you're going to want to just be aware of, and then there's some things that you probably want to bring with you if you're taking a trip or maybe taking that first drive in a car you're not familiar with. There's some stuff that you're going to want to have in the vehicle with you that would be good ideas for spares. So let's take a closer look. So first off, it's absolutely worth noting that if you drive your car regularly and you follow the maintenance schedule, you're probably rarely going to have trouble. It's usually when the car sits that things just break or dry up. Everything else is really just wear. Follow the maintenance schedule, you're not going to have too big of a problem with that. But anyway, one thing that I've had trouble with on a number of cars that have been sitting, usually I buy it from somewhere and it just doesn't run right. Maybe it's a fresh restoration, Craigslist restoration, and it just wasn't done properly. What you'll find is sometimes the fuel tank has sediment in it, and it could be rust, it could be scale, it could just be varnish from the fuel sitting too long. And what's going to happen is, as the engine's drawing fuel out of the tank, that rust is going to go into the line, it's going to clog it up, and you're going to starve off your fuel flow to the engine. So what you're going to notice is when you're driving, the engine's just going to die, almost like you're running out of gas, even though the tank might be full. And then a few minutes later, starts right back up magically, because after the engine dies, the fuel will make it past whatever the obstruction is slowly. You can run for a few more minutes, and then it's going to have the same problem all over again. So you can test for this a couple of ways. One way would be to have a fuel pressure gauge. Pull one of the lines off, stick the fuel pressure gauge on. If you've got a primer pump, you can use that. Otherwise, just rotate the engine a few times. You want to see what pressure you're getting. If you have Webers on your car, you're going to need 4 to 5 psi. That's normal, what you're going to buy in a parts store. For Zenith, Stromberg, and SUs, 1 to 2 psi is really all you need. If you have more than that, it's going to leak. But if you've got 1 to 2 psi, you're fine. So if you're having a problem, check the fuel pressure. Another thing that's helpful is to have a clear fuel filter that you can see through. I know it's not Concord, but if you can see the fuel going into it, then you can also see when there's not fuel going into it. And that makes it pretty easy to diagnose. If the car dies and you take a look near the engine bay and you see that there's no fuel in the filter, but the tank is full, you know you've got some kind of an obstruction. So what you do next then, try getting some compressed air, blow the fuel back into the tank. Don't use very high pressure, but if suddenly it starts rushing out, you know you've got an obstruction in the line. Maybe you've just fixed it temporarily, but eventually you're going to need to either take the tank and get it cleaned, or just replace the tank. It could be somewhere in the lines, but find that obstruction, get rid of it. You'll never have a problem with it again, so long as you drive the car regularly. I mentioned you could use a fuel pressure gauge too. If you don't have a clear filter, or even if you do, you should really have one of these. And what you're going to do is you can either plug it directly into a fuel line like this, or if you want to see the problem while you're driving, a modern car has sensors all over the place. The dashboard's going to report it to you. There's going to be a code you can look up. With these older vehicles, you just don't have that. So the only way that you can diagnose a problem while it's driving, if you don't have a dynamometer, is to disconnect the fuel line and put in one of these little T's, which you can then run to your fuel pressure gauge. You can find these at pretty much any hardware store. Open up a line somewhere, get 2 pieces of small fuel line, just put this in so that you've got fuel that will run to the carbs and to your fuel pressure gauge. And then you could put this under the windshield wiper, just run the hose around. You obviously don't want to do this for very long. Be careful, fire hazard, blah, blah, blah. But it's a great way to see the fuel pressure while you're driving. If you see that the pressure then is dropping while you're driving and the engine happens to be dying at the same time, then you're either out of gas or you've got an obstruction somewhere, and this is a great way to diagnose that. The next area of concern gets a bad reputation, but of course it's the carburetors. A couple of things: if you're just getting your car out of storage, open up the dash pots, and you want to have it set up so that when you get down to the last 1/4 inch or so, you're feeling some resistance when you push it back in. If you don't feel that resistance, then the oil has disappeared from the dash pots. It might be a bad O-ring and that's supposed to be holding that in. But what's going to happen, you're going to notice that when you step on the accelerator, you're not going to get a richer mixture. You're going to get the car just misbehaving when you're trying to accelerate. At idle or cruising, it'll work just fine. But if you're having trouble with acceleration, check the dash pot oil first. Clean the air filters. Carburetors really aren't going to give you much trouble at all if the car is driven regularly. The only issues that you're likely to experience if it hasn't been driven regularly, sometimes the needles, the metering needles will corrode, and if that happens, it's going to throw off your mixture. It could get stuck. You might have the air valve, the piston inside that's going up and down, that could get stuck. And if that happens, you need to free it up because that has to be able to move, otherwise it's not going to work properly. Or you could have inside the fuel float bowls, the floats could turn into sinks if they're leaking. Or there's a needle valve in there. What happens is the float goes up, shuts off the needle valve, which shuts off the flow of fuel into that carburetor. If your needle valve is stuck, open or closed, it's going to disrupt what you are supposed to have for that flow of fuel. So you might see it where you're getting fuel just flowing out. That could be the float isn't functioning. It could be a needle valve. But generally speaking, if you've rebuilt your carburetors and they've been done correctly and you drive the car periodically, you should rarely, if ever, have any trouble over here. But just generally give it a good visual inspection, make sure everything is free, make sure nothing's leaking. You don't want your hoses to be dry and cracked because the last thing you want is fuel leaking when you're anywhere near the exhaust manifold. I guess generally you don't want fuel leaking anyway. Make sure the springs are attached, make sure that your dampers are full, as I mentioned before. And then also, you see this line right here, this is for the vacuum advance system. And you're going to want to make sure that that's connected or that it's not leaking. And you could do that with a vacuum gauge, and what you're looking for is just to verify that you don't have air that is getting leaked into the carburetors. Depending on how this is set up, it's going into the manifold when the throttles are either open or closed, but you don't want to introduce an air leak at any time that isn't supposed to be there. So you want to double check and make sure that's in good shape. If you're having running trouble, that could be a problem. But generally speaking, like I said, once rebuilt, you're not going to have an issue with the carbs. One thing of note, these are SUs, but if you've got a set of Zenith Strombergs, on the bottom is the float bowl on those. It's not off to the side like with SUs. And on later Zenith Stromberg carbs, there is a little brass cap. It's part brass, part plastic, I guess, whatever it is. Anyway, it just sits in the bottom of the float bowl. It's a leftover from a different design, and there's a little O-ring on it. And that O-ring just fails. And so you could potentially have a leak out from the bottom of the carb. If you do, check that O-ring in the float bowl. You can just replace it, epoxy the thing back in place. You'll never have a problem with it again. That's going to go without saying, whenever you take your car out of storage, and even just periodically, you want to check to make sure all the fluids are full, make sure that they're clean. That could be a sign of a problem. In fact, these hydraulics, that's a potential area for concern, but usually these are going to give you plenty of warning. So if your brakes are leaking, the most common thing that I've seen is going to be either the master cylinder or a wheel cylinder in the back is even more common than that. That could be leaking. Pull the rear wheel, double check the wheel cylinder, look for wetness. If there is any, it's leaking, you need to replace that. Sometimes with the brake cylinder, you can get an internal leak, and your fluid will be full, but you'll be stepping on the brake, and it's just slowly going to sink to the floor, but you're not losing any fluid. And that's going to be the seals in here internally are just letting brake fluid go from the pressure side back into the reservoir, and eventually that's something you're going to have to fix. So get on it quickly because brakes are important. The other thing that you could do is pull this. You can kind of see, check for leaks underneath. If these are leaking, you might have brake fluid going into the floor of your car down by your feet. You might see it just leaking around here. You can kind of see on my Spitfire anyway, it's happened in the past. That's why there's some corrosion evident under the paint. Clutch, you've got your master here. The slave is going to be down on the side of the gearbox in the Spitfire, but it's one side or the other depending on what car you have. You want to make sure that that's not leaking. But again, first thing that you're going to see is that the fluid level is going to start dropping. So if your fluid is topped off all the time and it's not going anywhere, your hydraulics are in good shape, but it's something that you want to just double check and make sure that you see that fluid so that you can head off any problems before they actually affect you on the road. You want to make sure that the belts are tight, that there's not any wear or cracks in them that shouldn't be there. And then most of the issues that you're going to have are going to be under this distributor cap. The carburetors get blamed for a lot of issues that are actually under here. You need your wires to be in good shape. You need your cap and rotor to be in good shape. If this isn't timed properly, you could have unburned fuel going out the exhaust. It could smell a lot like you're burning too rich. And if your distributor is not timed correctly, you could blame the carburetors and you're just going to adjust them. It's not going to make the engine run any better, and you're not actually fixing the problem. So under the distributor cap is where a lot of the potential issues are. We already took a look at the vacuum. That's where that would go. Distributors have a two-piece shaft underneath. You should be able to rotate the rotor slightly with the distributor in place. It's actually a two-piece shaft that goes through it, and that needs to be free. Underneath then there are weights. Those could stick. We've done a video on the distributor and how it kind of goes together. Take a look at that. You'll see what I mean. But the weights could be sticking or the shaft could be frozen, and either one of those is going to stop your advance. And you'll notice that with the timing light when you have the engine running. If the timing doesn't advance when you add RPMs, and if it doesn't retard fully when you let off the gas, you know that either the shaft is sticking or the weights underneath are having a problem, but it needs to be advancing, and this is what's doing it. You'll notice on mine, I've got an electronic ignition. The electronic ignition does not replace the advance system. Say that with me. The electronic ignition has nothing to do with the advance. And so just because you've put on an electronic ignition doesn't mean you're getting an advance. You need to check that with the timing light and verify that it's happening properly. We've just covered 90% of any issues that you're likely to have on the car. There's a few exceptions. I mean, you might have, for example, a common one is the fuel and the temperature gauges might read too high. If both gauges are off, that tends to be, there's a voltage stabilizer that's on the back of the speedometer. And those gauges are basically voltmeters that work on a 10-volt system. The car's producing more than that. And so there's a voltage stabilizer that just gives it an even 10 volts. So if that's malfunctioning, you could either have it read too high or not at all. And all you got to do is just replace that piece on the back of the speedometer. You're good to go. But anyway, in terms of spares to keep in the car, if you're going on a trip, the important things, if you're running points, you're going to want a set of points and condenser. You're going to want a rotor. You're going to want a distributor cap. So I like to keep an entire spare distributor because if it's set up properly and you've already tested it on the car, you know that you can just pop that out and replace it at any time. But at the very least, if you're running points, you want to keep a set of points. You need a condenser. You're going to want to have a cap and rotor somewhere as spares in your car. The condensers are garbage nowadays. It's 50-50 odds that you're going to get a good one. And even if you do get one that works, it might fail in short order. So keep a spare. And in fact, if you know that the one that was in the car still works, hang on to it. Don't throw it out. If you're running points and you don't put a whole lot of miles on, there's not really a whole reason to switch. But it's something that if you have a breakdown, you can test that out and see if it helps. Again, most of your issues are going to be under that distributor cap, so make sure that it's advancing and retarding with your timing light. If it is, you're not likely to have a problem, but if you're driving around and your RPMs are just dropping, especially at idle, check the point gap, because it's pretty common that you're supposed to set this basically every oil change. Check the point gap and make sure that it's set properly. If it's not, then you could have an issue where the coil's not getting enough charging time. If the point gap isn't set properly, it could also be too advanced or too retarded, because that tends to move around the timing as well. Because remember, the spark plugs fire when those points open. So if they're opening too soon, then your spark is going to be advanced, and so it can throw off your timing. An electronic ignition can fix a lot of those problems, but an electronic ignition is not perfect, and those break too. So you're going to want to keep a spare set of points and a condenser just in case the rotors come apart, the caps fail. So again, I like to have a full distributor, but you're going to want at least the components for the ignition that you can just replace if you're broken down on the side of the road. Hidden down here then you've got your fuel pump, and that's also something that could potentially fail. Usually if it's a mechanical pump, you're going to have lower and lower pressure, maybe it's leaking, but you can get somewhere. I like to carry an electronic fuel pump with me at any time if I'm going on a longer trip, because regardless of why it's failed, you can usually just fix it. If you need to, you can have a hose that runs from the fuel tank side over to the side that's going to the carburetors, and you could just bypass the pump entirely. So that's an option. And an electric one, you could hook up somewhere near the fuel tank generally. Some of them you can hook up in the engine bay, and as long as it works, you're fine. You want to make sure that if you're running SUs or Strombergs, that fuel pump should be producing somewhere 1 to 2 psi. You really don't need more than that. The ones that are shooting out 4 to 5, that's going to be necessary for Weber carbs and for most American carbs, but it's going to overpower your SUs. And so if you've got too much pressure, it's going to overpower the floats, and you're going to be spitting fuel out of the carbs. So test the pump, make sure that it's working, and you just want to make sure that you're not getting too much pressure. You can keep an electric pump with you as long as you get a regulator as well, and then that way you can always just replace it or bypass it if you need, and you can get back on the road. As for spares with the carburetors, again, if you're having running issues with the carburetors, chances are you're not going to go on a trip. The needles, though, on the inside, those are not going to fail, not while you're on the road. It could fail if you've had the car sitting for a while. They could be corroded. You want to make sure, if you're rebuilding these, by the way, that you get that click sound when it drops back down, particularly with SUs. But generally speaking, you're going to have oil that's going to leak out from the dash pots, or you're going to have an issue with the float or the float valve. And so if you just pick up a couple of spares, keep them in the car with you, it doesn't take up much space, you're going to be good to go with carburetors. One potential issue with SUs is right here. This fuel pipe connects to the float bowl. Sometimes that tends to leak, but again, once it's together and you've had the car running, that's probably not going to be much of an issue. You're going to want to do a visual inspection of your water pump, your belt, but again, if something like that is going to go, it's probably going to give you plenty of warnings. So in terms of a spare, yeah, you could bring a water pump with you. You're probably not going to need it. They do have a tape that you can wrap around the hoses, and it sticks to itself, and it's waterproof, and it works against a certain amount of pressure. And so you might want to have a roll of that tape. I know Moss Motors, I think, sells it. You can probably get it from a few other sources, but that way you can do kind of a quick fix in case you get a leaking hose. But generally, if you're doing your maintenance and your hoses have been replaced, that's not going to be a problem anyway. Now this is more useful if you're in a shop, but if you're going on a longer trip, it is helpful to have just a selection of bolts. Make sure that you know what's on your car. With the Triumph Spitfire, in fact most Triumphs, if not all of them, it's not metric bolts. It's going to be national fine thread. So it's not going to be the stuff you're going to find at your typical hardware store. I know Ace Hardware around here always carries fine thread bolts. Have a selection. You don't need as many as these, but just have a few of a few different sizes, and that way you're good to go there. You could also just keep a selection of nuts and washers so that if you're doing a repair, you can find the parts that you need. And then obviously you want to keep your toolkit handy, because if something breaks, you're going to need to be able to repair it. You want to have a selection of pliers, different size wrenches that apply to your car. One other thing that we talked about earlier about the ignition system, if you want a quick double check that it works and you're on the road, you can get these. Look online for them. It's an indicator of whether or not that plug wire is firing. And basically you'd hold this against the wire, there's a little light bulb inside, and it'll sense the current in the light bulb flash if that plug is firing. And so kind of a neat little thing, you can keep it with you. An alternative would be, of course, to just disconnect one of the plugs and hold it near a ground, and if you see a spark, well then obviously it's working. But this is a way where you don't have to take anything apart. There are some tools out there where you can see the strength of your spark. And I like to use, you can go buy them. You can get a complete machine or an oscilloscope and just double check that everything's working. You can also pick one of these up from your auto parts store, and you either thread it in or thread it out to make a different size gap, and depending on how much voltage your coil is creating, it'll show you, the spark will be visibly jumping the gap. So that's kind of a neat tool that you can use. And then of course, you're going to want your shop manual. Something like this is fine. The Haynes manuals are great. I like to have, at least at home, I like to have a factory shop manual, because it's going to go a lot more in depth. If you look through any number of different manuals, sometimes you're going to find things have been misprinted. So the factory manual is going to be your best bet there in terms of getting the correct information. In some of the cars, if I can find them, you can get a glove box manual. That's just a smaller version, basically printed smaller. You can find PDFs online nowadays, and if you look through forums, it might not even cost you anything. But that way you've got your shop manual, and if you're on the road, you can look up numbers like, what is the point gap supposed to be? What's the plug gap need to be? How do I take apart this or that? It's all going to be in there, and you really need to have one of these. Now, of course, your car could be different, and so depending on the needs of your individual car, you might want to have different parts available with different tools. But the more you drive it, the more familiar you're going to be with it, and you'll have a better understanding of what you need to bring. So I'm curious to see what you guys have in your cars that you bring as spare parts or as tools. Post it in the comments below, let us know. If you've got questions, let us know that too. And otherwise, like, comment, subscribe, all of that sort of fun stuff. It helps out the channel. And we'll see you guys soon.